In November 1942, during the early hours of Operation Torch, a critical question faced American soldiers on the sands of North Africa. How do you stop an advancing tank when you have no weapons capable of destroying it? Stay with me until the end and I will reveal the answer. But first, let us set the stage. In the early 1940s, the United States Army was sending tens of thousands of young, largely untested troops across the Atlantic to engage Axis forces in territories they had never seen before. These soldiers, many barely out of basic training, were about to confront one of the most formidable instruments of modern warfare, the German armored divisions, armed with Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks. For infantrymen, the experience was terrifying. The thunder of tank engines, the gleam of steel treads, and the deadly accuracy of machine guns created a sense of impending doom. A group of soldiers disembarked at WWII beach in Morocco under the cover of darkness. The beaches were chaotic with landing craft, ammunition crates, and the cries of men unused to combat. Among the soldiers, whispers circulated about a strange new weapon that had been handed out only hours before. It was a long metal tube, almost 4.5 feet in length, with a trigger and a sight. Someone called it a bazooka. The army had promised that this weapon could stop enemy tanks, a claim that seemed almost miraculous to troops with only rifles, grenades, and makeshift anti-tank tools at their disposal. The men were given practically no training on the bazooka. Instructions consisted of a few hurried demonstrations and words of encouragement from officers who themselves were unfamiliar with the weapon. The situation was desperate. Traditional anti-tank rifles were obsolete, and anti-tank grenades were ineffective against the thick armor of German vehicles. Soldiers were told to aim at the tank, pull the trigger, and hope the rocket did its job. There was no margin for error, and the young infantrymen felt the weight of that responsibility acutely. As the first German tanks rolled over the horizon, the soldiers braced themselves. Hearts pounded in chests. They had never seen combat on this scale. The panzer divisions advanced in formation, their engines clattering and the smell of fuel and oil mixing with the dust of the desert. Soldiers lifted the bazookas, lined up their sights, and squeezed the triggers. Nothing happened. Time seemed to stretch unbearably. The rockets failed to fire. Panic spread among the ranks as men scrambled to reload, but repeated attempts yielded the same results. Some soldiers had their weapons explode upon firing, causing injuries among their own troops. Others found that the batteries powering the ignition system had failed in the cold morning air. The consequences were immediate and brutal. Infantrymen, previously confident that they could at least attempt to resist the tanks, now faced them with only their rifles and courage. The German armored units advanced without fear, crushing lightly armed defenders and forcing chaotic retreats, casualties mounted. Young men who had left training camps in the United States only weeks before found themselves confronted by the lethal combination of inexperience, inadequate equipment, and the unforgiving desert terrain. Every failed bazooka represented not just a missed shot, but a stark illustration of the cost of rushing a weapon into combat before it was ready. Yet the story of these failures is more than a tale of tragedy. It is also a story of the intense pressure of wartime innovation, of how desperation drives armies to try anything that might save lives, and of the difficult lessons learned on the front lines. Soldiers at WWII beach, despite their fear and the failures of the new weapons, displayed remarkable courage. They improvised with what they had. Some tried to jam grenades into the tracks of tanks. Others used small arms to harass crews, hoping to disrupt the vehicles long enough to allow infantry to maneuver. Every action, every attempt, was a testament to the resilience of men facing overwhelming odds. Even as the American forces struggled, but German troops, confident in their armored superiority, were not aware of the panic among infantrymen. From their perspective, the battlefield seemed to unfold according to the expected advantages of mechanized warfare. For the American troops, however, each failed shot became a lesson in the deadly reality of technological readiness. The bazooka, meant to be a tool of empowerment, had become a symbol of the gap between innovation and effective deployment. By the end of the first day of combat, officers began compiling detailed reports. They recorded which units had experienced failures, the environmental conditions that contributed to misfires, and the need for more rigorous testing under realistic battlefield circumstances. This documentation would later inform redesigns and training programs, ultimately saving countless lives in later campaigns. In retrospect, the events at Vidala Beach highlight both the dangers and the necessity of rapid innovation during World War II. The initial failures of the bazooka illustrate that even brilliant ideas require careful preparation, and that the cost of rushing new technology into combat can be measured in human lives. By watching closely and learning from these harrowing experiences, the U.S. Army began to understand the complex interplay between soldier readiness, technological reliability, and battlefield strategy. The story of the first bazookas is not just a cautionary tale. It is a story of courage, improvisation, and the urgent drive to adapt in the face of modern warfare. It teaches us that every technological breakthrough carries risk, and that the true cost of innovation is often only revealed under the pressure of combat. For the young men on the beaches of Morocco, the answer to our opening question, how do you stop a tank with no effective anti-tank weapons, was painfully clear. Not every idea works on the first attempt, and every failure can be deadly. Before the United States troops faced the chaos of North Africa, the Army had already been grappling with a startling realization: it was unprepared for modern mechanized warfare. In the late 1930s, European military developments had made it abundantly clear that traditional infantry weapons were insufficient against the new generation of armored vehicles. Tanks, once slow and vulnerable, had become fast, heavily armed, and capable of coordinating with artillery and air support in devastating blitzkrieg tactics. Germany had perfected this approach during its invasions of Poland and France, leaving Allied observers in shock. The American army, still thinking in terms of World War I trench warfare, was caught off guard. During World War I, the United States had experimented with rocket-propelled devices, but interest quickly waned after the armistice. The early rocket systems were cumbersome, inaccurate, and largely impractical for field use. After the war, budget constraints and a general sense that armored warfare was not a priority led to the neglect of rocket technology. Anti-tank defenses relied primarily on heavy rifles, fixed artillery emplacements, and static defenses, which might have sufficed in a slower, more predictable battlefield. By the late 1930s, however, these weapons were becoming obsolete in the face of mechanized armies that could move with unprecedented speed and firepower. The shock of Germany's blitzkrieg campaign served as a wake-up call. When France fell in 6 weeks in 1940, military planners in the United States realized that their concept of infantry versus armored vehicles was dangerously outdated. Reports from observers and military attaches highlighted the effectiveness of concentrated armor supported by mobile infantry, air reconnaissance, and rapid artillery strikes. The speed at which German tanks could break through defensive lines left little time for American anti-tank weapons to react. Field manuals, which still described defensive tactics from earlier wars, were suddenly irrelevant. The Army faced an urgent dilemma: traditional anti-tank guns, which were heavy, immobile, and limited in number, could not be deployed quickly enough to respond to fast-moving armored assaults. Grenades, rifles, and other infantry weapons lacked the firepower to penetrate tank armor. Commanders understood that a new solution was required, one that allowed individual soldiers to engage tanks directly and with some degree of mobility. The concept was simple: a portable, powerful weapon that could be carried by a single infantryman, aimed at an enemy vehicle, and capable of disabling it. The challenge, however, was immense. Military engineers and scientists began evaluating potential solutions. Among the options were rocket-propelled projectiles, shaped charges, and experimental small-caliber anti-tank guns. The problem was that the Army had no recent experience in deploying these technologies, and existing designs from the interwar period were either outdated or too complex for mass production. there was also a sense of urgency. With the United States likely to enter the global conflict, and with British forces already engaging German troops in North Africa, there was little time for the careful research and testing that peacetime development might allow. Decisions would have to be made quickly, even if it meant accepting higher risks. The early neglect of rocket technology was not unique to the United States. Many armies around the world had dismissed it as impractical, focusing instead on conventional artillery and machine guns. Yet by 1941, the limitations of conventional weapons against tanks had become undeniable. British forces in North Africa were struggling to adapt, and reports of heavy casualties from German armor emphasized the need for innovation. In Washington, the War Department convened committees to assess potential solutions. There was considerable debate about whether to invest in heavy, crew-served anti-tank guns or smaller, man-portable systems. Each approach had trade-offs. Heavy guns could stop any tank, but were slow to deploy. Man-portable rockets would allow soldiers to engage targets in flexible formations, but risked lower accuracy and reliability. Amid this urgency, the Army began prioritizing research into rocket weapons. Engineers experimented with different propellants, launch systems, and explosive warheads. They tested what materials could withstand the heat and recoil of a rocket launch while remaining light enough for a single soldier to carry. Laboratories were flooded with sketches, prototypes, and calculations. Each test revealed new problems: inconsistent ignition, unstable trajectories, and difficulty in handling rockets safely. Despite the challenges, the conceptual appeal was undeniable. A portable rocket launcher could allow infantrymen to challenge tanks in ways that rifles, grenades, and artillery could not. While engineers toiled, the Army also confronted bureaucratic obstacles. Funding was limited, and traditionalists within the military hierarchy questioned whether rockets could ever be practical. Some senior officers believed that tanks would be defeated primarily by other tanks, artillery, or air strikes, dismissing infantry rocket launchers as an experimental curiosity. Nevertheless, the rapid expansion of the Army after 1941, following the attack on Pearl Harbor, meant that new solutions were urgently needed. Every delay in development translated directly into battlefield vulnerability for troops arriving in combat zones like North Africa. By the time the American forces were preparing for Operation Torch, the situation was stark. Infantry units were being sent into battle against seasoned German armor with weapons that were untested in combat and in some cases unreliable. The Army had improvised as best it could. Officers hoped that hurriedly developed rocket launchers would provide a psychological boost and a potential tactical advantage, even though they had not been perfected. The failures that would occur on the beaches of Morocco were therefore not entirely surprising. They were the result of decades of neglect, rapid militarization, and the harsh lessons of modern warfare. The story of unpreparedness also reflects the broader challenge of military adaptation. The United States entered World War II with enormous industrial capacity and technical skill, but translating that potential into effective field equipment required time, experience, and iteration. The initial lack of effective anti-tank solutions underscores the difficulty of anticipating technological evolution in war. Tanks, mechanized infantry, and close air support had transformed the battlefield, and the Army had to learn to respond quickly or face catastrophic losses. In retrospect, the early failures of the United States Army against armored threats were an essential catalyst for innovation. The lack of effective anti-tank weapons created the conditions that led to the development of the bazooka, a revolutionary weapon that, once refined, would empower individual soldiers and change infantry tactics. The desperation felt by troops in North Africa, combined with the lessons of European battlefields, forced the Army to embrace rapid technological experimentation. Without the shock of unpreparedness, the urgency to innovate might have been delayed, and the development of portable rocket launchers like the bazooka might not have occurred in time to save lives and influence the course of the war. This backward look at why the Army was unprepared shows that the failures on the battlefield were not simply the result of poor planning at the last moment. They were the culmination of decades of neglect, slow adaptation, and misjudged priorities. The lesson is clear: warfare evolves faster than doctrine, and the cost of underestimating technological change is measured in both casualties and hard-learned experience. By understanding the roots of this unpreparedness, we can better appreciate the pressures that drove American engineers and soldiers to innovate desperately, setting the stage for the invention of the bazooka. In early 1942, as the United States confronted the urgent need for a portable anti-tank weapon, a team of inventive military officers took on a challenge that would redefine infantry combat. Major Leslie Skinner and Lieutenant Edward All were tasked with designing a weapon that could be carried by a single soldier, aimed and fired with enough power to destroy a German tank. The question before them was simple in theory, but formidable in practice. How does one create a weapon that is both powerful and portable, reliable under battlefield conditions, and easy enough for untrained soldiers to operate? At the time, rocket technology was in its infancy. Experiments with propellants, fuses, and projectiles had produced unreliable results. Rockets either failed to ignite, veered off course, or exploded prematurely. Skinner and All understood that any solution had to overcome these fundamental obstacles while remaining lightweight and simple. Their approach combined practical improvisation with careful observation of existing technologies. They studied German weapons captured in North Africa, reviewed World War I rocket experiments, and analyzed the physics of shaped charges. Every experiment revealed new insights, but also new problems. The innovation process was intense and urgent. Skinner and All worked in laboratories and workshops under constant pressure, aware that American soldiers were already entering combat zones with inadequate anti-tank defenses. The early prototypes were crude. Simple metal tubes became the starting point for a launcher that could guide a rocket accurately over short distances. They experimented with the diameter of the tube, the length, and the material, seeking a balance between durability and portability. The first test rockets often failed, veering wildly or failing to ignite at all, but each failure provided data. One of the key breakthroughs came from the realization that the ignition system, rather than the propellant, was the primary source of failure. Early designs required complicated fuses or electrical connections that were unreliable in field conditions. By simplifying the design and using a battery-powered ignition system, Skinner and All dramatically increased the reliability of their prototypes. This innovation meant that a single soldier could load the rocket, aim through a simple sight, and fire with minimal training. The simplicity of the system was crucial in the chaos of battle. There would be no time for complex procedures or troubleshooting. Meanwhile, the design of the rocket itself had to evolve. The engineers worked with explosives specialists to develop a shaped charge warhead capable of penetrating tank armor. This required precise calculations of explosive force, cone angles, and detonation timing. Early warheads either failed to penetrate the armor or caused the rocket to become unstable in flight. Through iterative testing and meticulous adjustments, they arrived at a design that reliably destroyed armored targets in controlled experiments. Each successful test brought them closer to a weapon that could be issued to troops with confidence. The collaboration between Skinner and All was marked by creativity and resourcefulness. They borrowed ideas from British anti-tank projects, adapted lessons from captured German equipment, and improvised solutions for manufacturing limitations. Their laboratory became a hub of experimentation, with rockets and metal tubes scattered across benches and floors. Despite the pressure, they maintained a rigorous approach to testing, documenting failures, and analyzing every result. This methodical experimentation ensured that when the weapon was finally fielded, it had a higher chance of success than any hastily conceived alternative. By mid-1942, the prototype had taken the recognizable form of the bazooka, a long, tubular launcher with a simple shoulder rest, a hand grip, and an electrical firing system. The first live tests impressed senior officers who had been skeptical of the concept. The simplicity of the design meant that soldiers could carry multiple units, engage targets from a safe distance, and reload quickly. The combination of portability, power, and ease of use represented a major shift in infantry tactics. For the first time, a single soldier had the potential to challenge a tank directly on the battlefield. The next step was mass production. The War Department, recognizing the urgent need for the weapon, authorized rapid manufacturing at multiple plants across the United States. Engineers had to adapt the design for large-scale production without compromising reliability. Materials were selected for availability as much as performance, and assembly lines were established to meet the growing demand. The pressure to produce quickly meant that quality control sometimes lagged behind innovation, a factor that would later contribute to failures in combat. But at the time, the priority was to equip troops with a new capability as soon as possible. As the weapon moved from prototype to production, training programs were hastily developed. Manuals explained operation in simple terms, and demonstrations were conducted to familiarize soldiers with loading, aiming, and firing procedures. Despite the minimal training, confidence in the bazooka grew. Commanders saw it as a potential force equalizer, allowing light infantry to confront armored divisions in ways previously unimaginable. Soldiers themselves, often skeptical of untested technology, became intrigued by the promise of a tool that could shift the balance of power on the battlefield. The story of the bazooka's creation highlights both the ingenuity and the urgency of wartime innovation. Major Skinner and Lieutenant all exemplified the type of inventive problem-solving that wartime circumstances demand. They took a complex technical challenge, broke it down into manageable components, and through experimentation and perseverance, produced a weapon that could fundamentally change infantry tactics. Their work was not perfect. The initial production models would encounter significant challenges in the field, but without their breakthrough, American soldiers in North Africa and later European campaigns would have faced even greater risks against German armor. By the time the first bazookas reached the front lines, expectations were high. Soldiers were eager to test the new weapon in combat, believing it could provide a crucial advantage against the formidable German tanks they would encounter. Officers hoped that the combination of portability, explosive power, and simple operation would allow infantry units to perform missions previously considered impossible. The innovation had created optimism, but it had also introduced new uncertainties. How would the weapons perform under the stress of real combat? Could soldiers, many of whom had minimal training, operate them effectively under fire? These questions would soon be answered, but not always in ways that were expected or desirable. The creation of the bazooka represents a key moment in military history, illustrating the intersection of desperation, ingenuity, and technological evolution. In a matter of months, the U.S. Army transformed a conceptual idea into a revolutionary weapon that empowered infantrymen in unprecedented ways. The collaboration of Skinner and all demonstrates that even under immense pressure, thoughtful experimentation and creative problem-solving can overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Their work laid the foundation for a weapon that would evolve into one of the most iconic tools of World War II infantry combat. When the first bazookas reached American troops in North Africa, hope was high, but reality quickly revealed a harsh truth. Despite the careful design and ingenuity of Major Leslie Skinner and Lieutenant Edward Ull, the weapon failed in combat in ways that engineers had not fully anticipated. Soldiers faced a combination of manufacturing defects, environmental challenges, and battlefield stresses that turned a promising innovation into a source of frustration and danger. Understanding these failures is essential to appreciating how the bazooka evolved into one of the most important infantry weapons of World War II. One of the most significant problems was inconsistent manufacturing quality. The rush to produce bazookas in large quantities meant that assembly lines sometimes prioritized speed over precision. Welds on the launch tubes were occasionally weak, triggers misaligned, and electrical connections prone to failure. Some rockets failed to ignite due to faulty contacts in the firing mechanism. When soldiers lifted the weapons against approaching tanks, they discovered that what was supposed to be a reliable weapon often became unpredictable. In certain cases, the rocket would ignite but fail to leave the launcher, resulting in injury to the operator and those nearby. Environmental conditions also played a major role in early failures. Soldiers in North Africa faced extreme temperatures, both hot during the day and cold at night. The batteries powering the ignition system were highly sensitive to temperature fluctuations. Cold mornings caused batteries to lose charge, preventing the rocket from firing. Dust and sand infiltrated the firing mechanism and rocket tubes, causing jams or misfires. Combat in the desert exposed the weapon to conditions far harsher than laboratory tests, revealing vulnerabilities that had not been fully addressed. The design of the rockets themselves contributed to unreliability. Early warheads were temperature sensitive and sometimes unstable in storage or transport. The shaped charge, while theoretically capable of penetrating tank armor, required precise construction. Inconsistent assembly led to rockets that exploded prematurely or failed to detonate upon impact. Some infantrymen reported cases in which rockets exploded a few feet from the target, or in rare instances, backfired into their own troops. These failures created a crisis of confidence among soldiers who had been counting on the bazooka to level the playing field against armored threats. Training limitations compounded the problem. Because the weapons were rushed into service, soldiers received minimal instruction on how to operate them effectively. Manuals were brief, and demonstrations often lacked sufficient detail. Infantrymen encountering tanks in combat had little opportunity to practice under realistic conditions. They had to learn through experience, often at the cost of their own safety. Mistakes such as improper angle of fire, incorrect loading, or failure to account for wind and recoil led to missed shots and dangerous misfires. Even well-designed equipment can be rendered ineffective if the operators are not adequately prepared, and the first bazookas exemplified this harsh lesson. Despite these setbacks, the failures themselves provided crucial data. Field reports documented every malfunction, environmental challenge, and operational mistake. Engineers studied these reports meticulously, identifying patterns and root causes. It became evident that the electrical ignition system needed a redesign, batteries had to be more robust and heat-resistant, and warheads required stricter quality control. The Army also recognized the importance of extensive training for soldiers, incorporating live-fire exercises and tactical guidance to improve effectiveness. Each failure became a step toward refinement. The rapid evolution of the bazooka highlights the iterative nature of wartime innovation. Initial combat experience forced engineers and commanders to confront the difference between theoretical design and practical application. Lessons learned from misfires, explosions, and environmental failures led directly to modifications in launcher construction, battery design, rocket propellant, and warhead reliability. These improvements were implemented in subsequent models, resulting in weapons that were significantly more effective and safer for soldiers to use. By the time the United States Army deployed bazookas in the European theater of operations in 1944, they were far more dependable, capable of reliably disabling German tanks and fortifications. Another factor in early failures was overconfidence in the novelty of the technology. Commanders sometimes assumed that simply issuing a revolutionary weapon would automatically confer battlefield advantage. The reality of combat, however, was far more complex. Tanks did not always present easy targets. They moved quickly, coordinated with other armored units, and were supported by infantry and artillery. Infantrymen had to master timing, positioning, and concealment in addition to the technical operation of the bazooka. The weapon's initial shortcomings underscored that innovation alone is insufficient. Effective use depends on training, strategy, and experience. Over time, the lessons learned from the first bazookas reshaped infantry warfare. Improved models, standardized production, and comprehensive training programs transformed the weapon into a reliable anti-tank tool. By the Normandy invasion in 1944, American soldiers could effectively engage German armor, significantly enhancing their operational capabilities. The evolution from flawed prototype to trusted weapon demonstrates the vital relationship between experimentation, failure, and eventual success in military technology. Without the painful lessons of the early failures, the bazooka might never have achieved its later battlefield effectiveness. The story of the bazooka's failure and eventual success also reflects broader themes in wartime innovation. Desperation drives creativity, but hasty deployment carries risk. Courageous soldiers must often act as the first users of untested technology, facing danger as part of the development process. Engineers and military planners learn from real-world feedback, continuously refining designs to meet the realities of combat. This cycle of innovation, failure, adaptation, and improvement is a hallmark of technological progress in war. In the end, the initial failures of the bazooka were not signs of defeat, but rather the crucible in which a revolutionary infantry weapon was forged. Soldiers who had once faced tanks with unreliable rockets became the foundation for a system that would later change the balance of power on the battlefield. Through careful redesign, rigorous testing, and improved training, the bazooka evolved into one of the most iconic and effective weapons of World War II. It demonstrated that even the most promising technology must endure the challenges of combat to reach its full potential. The story of America's first bazookas reminds us that innovation often carries risk, and that the cost of rushing a weapon into battle can be high. Yet it also shows that failure is not the end, but the beginning of improvement. The bravery of soldiers on the front lines, combined with the ingenuity of engineers behind the scenes, ultimately transformed a flawed prototype into a powerful tool of war. Lessons learned from these experiences continue to inform military strategy and weapon development to this day, illustrating that even in the midst of failure, progress is possible.